Good afternoon and welcome back to our second session of the day. Like I said, we're going to another very theoretical presentation of the township approach to valuation. This is our last theoretical discussion, and then we do a few practical calculations. Township valuations. You might have realized, I think everywhere else nowadays, the township approach is one method that is nowadays being used to convert agricultural land into residential property. As you know, the demand for property is always on the high, and due to massive urbanization, the urban boundaries keep expanding beyond its original designated boundaries. So that's why now you find land which is normally on the peripherals of the urban boundaries is converted to townships. So what we're talking about now is how do you value a land which is earmarked for township development. So that's why now we're talking about what we call the township approach to valuation. This is the method that you use to value a land which is ripe for township development. And I want to state the township approach to valuation is basically very, very similar to the residual method of valuation. The only difference which you need to know is, when do you use the residual method of valuation? You use the residual method of valuation to value a piece of land which has got development potential or redevelopment potential. And a piece of land that has got development potential, you use the residual method of valuation. However, any piece of land which has got subdivision potential, and a piece of land that has got subdivision potential, you use the township approach to valuation. Okay. And land that you could subdivide into different stands and sell those stands to calculate the present value of that land, you are going to use the township approach. So, as an opening remark, basically, the establishment of township is the first step in the creation of individual parcels of land, and is the process by which agricultural land eventually becomes developed as part of the urban area. That's what I talked about earlier. So this is basically the process where land which was or is originally earmarked or zoned agricultural is now converted into residential by subdividing it and creating a township. So one thing you need to be aware of in doing that process, there are so many legislations which govern subdivision of land. So you need to be aware of such legislations. Subdivision of land is regulated by some of those legislations that I've put up there. The Subdivision of Agricultural Land Act, of course there could be many amendments. The Township Establishment Act and the Development Facilitation Act. Those are just some of the legislations which affect or which you need to know when or regulate how and what type of land should be subdivided. Okay, so when we're talking about the township approach to valuation, basically we are talking about that land that is initially earmarked or zoned agricultural, that is ripe to be converted now into a township through subdivision. That is the township approach to valuation. So then, in that process, there are so many professions that are going to be required in converting that agricultural land from agriculture to a township. So basically now that's what we now talk about as the professional team. What I've put up there are some of the professionals that would be involved in township establishment. You would have a town planner, a civil engineer, electrical engineer, and so there. At this stage, I believe we all know exactly the full extent and the full extent of involvement of these professionals in the township establishment process. Okay, so those are just some of the professionals that will be required in most of the township establishment exercises. Do we have any question on the extent of involvement of any of those professionals? We understand very well.
Landscape, maybe the landscape architect.
Landscape architect will be responsible for the landscaping of that township. Is the guy who is going to decide which plants should be built in which corner, which the type of lawns that should be put in that township. It's about the grounds, the lawns. Yeah, landscape architects are a specialized type of architects. Otherwise, they normally concentrate on the ground, the lawns, the flowers, and the like.
And geologist for the mineral rights.
Geologist is for the exactly mineral rights and the subsoil to establish exactly the conditions of the soil. Now, geologists could be like technical surveyors, engineers.
Geotechnician.
Exactly. To establish, to see exactly if the soil condition is suitable for the type of structures that could be put on that land. Yes. You don't want to build a township on unstable soil.
Or underwater.
Or on floodlights, exactly. Underwater, exactly. You don't want to wake up one time and find the whole township is because you built on a sinkhole. A sinkhole.
Single.
When the land is unstable underneath, whereby it opens up at one time and then swallows everything that is built on top. Basically unstable soils.
Yes.
Yeah. So geotechnical surveyors should ensure that the condition of the soil, of the ground, is strong enough to carry whatever type of development that will be put up there. What is the work of an attorney in there? Lawyers.
Transfer.
Exactly. Transferring of that property. So basically that is it may not be depending on the size of the township. That may not be an exhaustive list, but commonly speaking, those are some of the professions that could be involved in the township development process. Okay. Physical aspects of township development. What do you need to pay particular attention from the physical aspect of that township? Like we said now, geological conditions. That's where one of the most important soil conditions. You don't want to establish a township on a land which is unstable. That would be risky.
Like one valuer did a valuation and the report that he submitted say it's it's a flood area.
Flood.
Yes.
Yeah.
But he didn't do his investigation properly. There was a report from those guys.
Yeah. To say you cannot build in here.
Yeah. No, they say it can be built.
Oh, it can be built. Oh,
So
okay.
he made his own decision and said it's flat area. The report that was submitted to the Ministry of Urban and Rural Development was fine because maybe.
Yeah, he just assumed. Yeah, he just assumed.
The development in the area
Mm.
is no more flooding area.
Exactly.
But he just heard someone
Mhm.
talking about like.
The front line. Yeah.
So he left the whole thing.
No.
Oh,
After we queried it and investigated again, we found that
Then you feel that
certificate.
Exactly.
Oh.
So on the physical aspect, ladies and gentlemen, though you need to pay particular attention to those things. The geological condition, the flood lines, like you are saying, the topography. Oftentimes, the township should be ideally developed, like we said, on a flat line, because it's going to be cheaper for provision of infrastructure. So pollution and environmental constraints, location, density, those are the physical
This all
aspects.
stuff comes into that what you call the report.
Environmental impact assessment.
Impact assessment.
Exactly. EIA. The EIA should give you all those conditions. Yeah. But those are very, very important. And that EIA should then even give you a go ahead or not go ahead on that land. If that land is not suitable based on those physical aspects of that land. Okay. So you need to investigate those things properly in your feasibility studies. Other physical aspects, you know, the most important and the most costly aspect of a township development is the provision of bulk services. So know exactly the responsibility of the developer and the responsibility of the local authority. The local authority is responsible for provision of bulk services up to the boundary of the township, whereas the all internal bulk services are the responsibility of the developer. Okay, and those are the the biggest cost aspects of township development process. It's bulk service provision. And bulk services provision, we're talking about roads, water reticulation, sewerage, stormwater, and the electrical facilities. So internal services provided by the developer, whilst external services are the responsibility of the local authority. The other important aspect will be the legal aspects. There are also legal implications in township development. And one of the most important legal aspect are the title deed condition. Remember, every title deed has got its own conditions. So if this agricultural land had certain title conditions, before that land can be converted into a residential township, you need to make sure that if those title deed conditions do not permit the establishment of a title, may not permit the establishment of a township, it's then your responsibility to make sure that those conditions of title are first and foremost dealt with or removed, so that the property now, this township, when it's established, it will be established without those onerous or those negative original title conditions of agricultural property. So that is very, very important. You don't want to establish a township when on a property with a title which does not permit you to build certain types of houses.
Like we develop get a piece of land from the local authority, and that in the memorandum of understanding was between us and in the town council. So on that piece of land there was still village people, and they should have deal with it. Okay,
Yes.
they tell us they deal with it, but in the first phase, no problem. When we start the second phase, then we have a big problem.
Yes.
I think it's about 30 how everyone influenced, but then we couldn't build it. Until now, there's still...
So the project is stalled. You cannot
No,
continue
no.
with the project.
Yeah, outside those piece of land of those people, we continue,
Yeah.
but unfortunately,
You could not remove those.
we
Exactly.
can't remove them. So
Exactly.
it's an obstacle. So
It
those
is.
ones,
So that is very, very important. It's always good that you deal with the legal aspects of the land first and foremost in the early stages of the development. And one of the legal aspects is, like I said, the title conditions. Make sure that if there are any cumbersome or onerous conditions of title, make sure that those are removed before the subdivisions, so that once the subdivisions are made, the stands are now sold without any negative title conditions. The other legal aspect would be the mineral rights. Always, it's required that you always get the consent of the mineral right holder. So before you subdivide any land, whoever, if there are minerals on that land, and we all know who owns the minerals, it's always a must that you always need to get consent from the one who was the mineral rights on that property. Okay? And now on the social side also, that sounds very funny, but this is one thing that can basically contribute to the success or failure of a township development. Graves. That is the social aspect.
Mhm.
We know mostly on there are people that bury the dead ones on the farms. So if that land is what you need to for your township, and you discover there are some people that have been buried on that land, you just can't move in there and start developing a township.
I'm sitting with a problem
You've got
with that one
Practical.
right
yes.
now
You see?
in the pool because of
So-
graves.
Exactly. So what you needed to do now is you need before you even do anything else, establish if there are any graves on that piece of land. And if they are there, identify the owners of these graves, and then you exhume them and what do they call it? Bury, find other alternative places to rebury their remains. Otherwise, without that, it's going to give. So, what is your situation? How is it?
The problem is, I don't know how they buy that, how he buy the land, but the municipality there's no documents in the municipality, but he have documents from ditch office, which is
Mhm.
fine. But the problem is now the size of that piece of land. There's a lot of urban and it is very primitive people, the Himba. Maybe those people who don't wear.
Oh yes, those dress family.
Yeah, they
yes,
those,
yeah.
they're open. Yeah.
Traditional.
Those people, it's
Oh,
those graves.
yeah.
And unfortunately, I have to cut those pieces of land
Yeah.
out,
Yes.
and that's where me and the owner have
Mm.
an issue now.
Yeah. Definitely, because that you should have addressed those social issues in the beginning of the project. You don't want to start a project without addressing those, because eventually, like you've just experienced, they will become and they will result in total project failure. Yeah, you will not make the money that you thought you'd make out of the project, because certain land, if there are people's graves there, you just not develop them.
Now for him, it's not a problem,
Mm-hmm.
but through the bank side,
Yes,
it will have an influence
of course.
at the end of the day, because
Mm-hmm.
if they register a bond against that property, then
Exactly.
and they must sell it, then it's a problem.
Nobody else would want to buy such a property. Exactly. So legal aspects are extremely important in township development. Title deed condition, mineral rights, and on the social side, the graves. So before you establish that township, make sure that you pay particular attention to all these aspects. And financial aspects, what are the financial aspects for township development? Remember, most township developers are serious business people. You are in the business to make money. So the objective of township developer is to make a profit. Therefore, in making that profit, you need to pay particular attention to the following aspects in your feasibility study. Know exactly how much, make sure you buy cheaper so that you make maximum profit. Know exactly how much rates and taxes you are going to pay for the land before you sell it. Have an idea of how much it's going to cost you in professional fees. Remember all that professional team we are talking about. All those professionals are going to require big bucks, exactly. And most importantly, know the prices. Do your market research to establish at how much are you going to sell the stands, and how quickly are you going to sell the stands, because that is where your money is coming from. So those are the financial aspects of the township development. The major objective of a developer is to maximize profit. So you only maximize profit when you minimize costs. So you need to do that cost-benefit analysis right in your feasibility stages. Make sure you spend little in order to maximize the profit. Know each and every cost aspect of your development. before you determine to launch into that project. Know every cost aspect and then know the income that you are going to get out of that. And that information all need to be based on market research, especially on the selling prices. We are going to see when we do that simple example that I've given you. Costs in township development. What constitutes major costs in township development? Basically, those are the things that constitute major costs in township development. It's more about the bulk services. Environmental impact study, and environmental impact study is extremely important, especially depending on the size of the development that you are going to put up. Rates and taxes, and then time. Also, time is important on that aspect because the quicker that you are going, the developer sells the stands, the more profitable it is to him. Because those stands that you don't sell, you are going to be responsible for the rates for those stands. So the quicker that you transfer the stands to the new buyers, the more profitable that the whole project is going to be to you as a developer. That's why we mentioned time as a cost factor in the township as that established. So do your feasibility study properly such that you are guaranteed of selling based on your market research. You are guaranteed of selling as much as possible in the quickest possible time. Okay. So those are the costs that are involved in township development. So for valuation purposes, what do you need? Information needed for valuation. You need a township layout. Township layout to show you exactly the number of stands that are going to be in that township with their sizes. You need to know exactly at how much you are going to be selling the stands. That information should be based on your market research. Do your market research to establish exactly what would be the selling prices of your stands, based on also your target market. In the layout, township layout, the sizes of the stands should be determined by your target market. If your township establishment, if your target market for the township is the low income earners, then the sizes of the stands should be slightly small, which makes it slightly cheaper. So if your target market is upmarket guys, they want bigger stands and they can afford any price. So those are the things. The whole purpose is know your target market, and based on your target market, that will influence the size, the layout of the stands as well as the sizes. And then from there you should then also know, based on the market research and the number of stands in your layout, you should be able to estimate the average income that you could get from your stands. The total income from the sales as well as the total development cost. So the value of the township development now is going to be basically the difference between the total development cost and the total income from the project, just like the residual method of valuation. That's why I was saying this approach is exactly the same as the residual method. The only difference is you use the township approach for the pieces of land that have got subdivision potential, whereas you use the direct residual method for that piece of land which only has redevelopment potential. Then the basis is the value of that land is going to be the difference between the sales development value and the development cost. That gives you the net present value of the township. Okay. Then how do you go about valuing that land or establishing the net present value of that land? basically that's where you use the discounted cash flow approach. So determine the total value of all the stands, compile a discounted cash flow, take into account the prices of the stand, the expenses, and all the income at whatever specific periods of time. Remember, you are not going to sell all these stands at once. So you need to project the income that you are going to be receiving at specific period of the year or over the life of the entire project. So then also project the expenditures, all the expenses that are going to be incurred. If there are going to be any expenses in the long run, you also need to project that. So expected time of sale need to be taken care of, and then discount the expenses as well as the income at an appropriate market related discount rate to get your net present value. And that net present value is assumed to be the value of that development. So it's as simple as that theoretically, but practically it's a very, very involving process. We are going to see exactly when we look at that simple example that I've given you. So that's the method you need to go through. And the approach, like I said, the township approach is basically the closer to the residual valuation approach. So the township development approach combines both the market and the income capitalization approaches, as well as the cash flow. So on one side, you establish the total development cost. On the other side, you establish the total development value using whichever method. The total development value would either be based on the income method or the comparable sales method. So basically that's what the township development approach is. So it comprises an investor's model based on the concept that the land value is equivalent to the present value of the difference between the income that will be derived from the sale of the subdivided event and the cost that it will be incurred in producing that income. That is basically the whole concept of this method. It's just like the residual method of value. The value of that land is going to be the difference between the total development cost and the total development value. Excuse me. Okay, so that is the township approach. Conditions for development. This is like now what we talked about initially when we were talking about the physical aspects. In the environmental impact assessment, you should take note of all these things. Condition for development. For any development to be very profitable, the land must be first and foremost suitable for development in all aspects. The physical nature, all those legal constraints should be cleared. The development must also be optimal. The township development approach also assumes the concept of highest and best use. So it must be most optimal, and even at this stage I know you know that the full definition of the highest and best use concept is that use that's going to result into the highest present value when it satisfies those three criteria, which is it must be legally permissible, physically possible, and economically viable. And the development must also be practical, and then the stands should as well be marketable. Those are just some of the conditions for development. Okay. Development costs. like I said, these are all very theoretical discussions, which at this stage I'm sure most of you actually have some idea of the township development. The following details should be ascertained when determining the development costs. The period required to obtain the approval and proclamation, as well as the tendering process, how much it is going to cost you to install the services, your professional fees, the rates, and the timing of those costs. Those are basically what will constitute the cost of that development.
The same as the residual.
Exactly.
Excessive.
Yeah. That's why I was saying this is basically like the residual. You just need to know the difference. This is for subdivided land, whilst the residual is only on one stand for redevelopment. Otherwise, the process then remains the
New
same.
or redevelopment.
New or redevelopment. Yeah. Then the process is exactly the same.
Looks the same.
Yeah. Okay. So income from sales, you know exactly where the income from the sales is going to come from. When determining the income from sales, the following must be established and estimated. How much are you going to sell the stands? You need to do your market research well. Based on your market research, you're going to establish how much demand there is for that stand, for that type of stands rather, and based on your target market as well. Selling periods, take into account the date of proclamation up to the last one. Selling costs, also those are just some of the costs that you are going to incur when selling these stands. And basically that's where that theoretical discussion ends. Like you said, like you've all noticed, the township approach is basically like the residual method evaluation. The only difference is you apply the township approach to that land which has got subdivision potential, whereas you use the residual method to that land which has got development or redevelopment potential. Okay, so in the township valuation, township approach, your main responsibility as a valuer is to establish or to work out in your feasibility, when preparing the feasibility study, work out what constitutes the costs and work out what constitutes the income properly and accurately. Because if you miss out on those, then that may affect the profitability of your development. So it's all about you now determining the income of that project and determining the total costs which are associated with that project. Then you discount them to today, and you get the net present value using the discounted cash flow approach, and the net present value is assumed to be the value of that land. That's the way it works. Okay. Any question? I've given you an example of a township exercise. That is a very simplified exercise. But it's enough to show us how the township approach works in practice. So I want us to take a 5 minutes break. 5 minutes while we are still seated here, probably, if you don't want to go out. Then we go through we start looking at the practical calculation. If you don't have the exercises, I will give you, I think I've got some few copies. Then we look at the rest. Can we just take another 5 minutes?